What happens when one of Hollywood's most intense, notoriously private actors walks into a bright, cheerful morning studio and finds himself facing the most condescending, disrespectful interrogation of his entire career? What happens when a man who has built his reputation on raw, unfiltered authenticity finally reaches his breaking point under the glare of live television lights? Today, we're diving into the explosive moment that had Tom Hardy storming off Good Morning America after a brutal confrontation with George Stephanopoulos, leaving millions of viewers stunned and the entertainment world absolutely buzzing. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how not to treat a guest, and George Stephanopoulos was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because you won't believe how this whole situation unfolded. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday morning as Tom Hardy settled into the familiar guest chair on Good Morning America. The legendary actor, known for his chameleon-like performances in films like Mad Max, The Revenant, and Venom, had agreed to this appearance as part of his media tour for a new, deeply personal project. Unlike the typical Hollywood press junket, this film was something he had poured his heart and soul into, a passion project that had taken years to bring to the screen. He'd been looking forward to this appearance, especially since Good Morning America had a massive audience that might not typically seek out his more intense, independent work. But something felt different today. The energy in the room was tense, and George Stephanopoulos seemed unusually agitated, even before the cameras started rolling. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studios. Tom Hardy arrived early, dressed in his characteristic casual style, a simple jacket, a t-shirt, looking every bit the serious, working actor. He exchanged pleasantries with the crew, signed a few autographs, and prepared for what he expected to be a standard promotional interview. George Stephanopoulos, the veteran journalist, sat at the main desk with his co-hosts, shuffling through his notes with visible intensity. As the show's theme music faded and the cameras rolled, George offered the standard warm welcome that viewers had come to expect. But there was already an undercurrent of tension that seemed to emanate specifically from George's direction. He had that look in his eyes, the one that regular viewers knew meant he was ready to press, to push, to stir the pot. "Tom, thank you so much for being here," George began, his voice carrying that familiar authoritative tone. "We're so excited to talk about your new project." Tom Hardy nodded politely, offering a reserved but genuine smile. "Thanks for having me," he replied in that distinctive, gravelly voice that had captivated audiences around the world. But before George could continue with his planned questions, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The co-hosts exchanged glances, sensing that something was different about this interview. George leaned forward, his posture becoming more aggressive, more confrontational. "You know, Tom, I have to ask, and I know our viewers are curious about this too. You've built this reputation as one of the most intense actors of your generation. But some people say that intensity comes across as arrogance, that you're difficult to work with, that you're dismissive of the press. How do you respond to that?" The question hung in the air like a lead balloon. The studio fell silent. Tom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. "I wouldn't say I'm arrogant, George. I just take my work seriously. I prefer to let the work speak for itself rather than spending all my time talking about it." Tom responded, his tone measured but with a slight edge that anyone paying attention would have noticed. George, however, either didn't pick up on the warning signs or simply chose to ignore them. He leaned back in his chair, that smirk that his critics knew all too well spreading across his face. "Oh, come on, Tom. We've all seen the clips. The interviews where you practically bite the reporter's head off. The red carpets where you look like you'd rather be anywhere else. The stories about you walking off sets when things don't go your way. You've got this reputation, and I think our viewers deserve to know if it's accurate." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly. "Those are different situations, George. And I think you're mischaracterizing what actually happened. I've always been professional with people who are professional with me." The co-hosts, sensing the growing tension, tried to redirect the conversation. "Tom, let's talk about your new film. The role seems really challenging and different from what we've seen you do recently. But George wasn't finished. In fact, he was just getting started. And what came next would prove to be the catalyst for everything that followed. You know what I find interesting, Tom? Here you are, this incredibly successful actor, but you seem to have such disdain for the very industry that made you famous. I mean, you've made millions from these big blockbuster franchises, and yet you act like you're above it all. The accusation was delivered with George's typical bluntness, but this time he had clearly crossed a line. Tom's eyes flashed with something that went beyond mere annoyance. This was personal now. I think you have a fundamental misunderstanding of what I do and why I do it, Tom replied, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet tone that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning. I've never claimed to be above anything. I take my craft seriously, and I expect the people I work with to do the same. I've dedicated my life to this art form, to pushing myself to the limit, to becoming characters that challenge me both physically and emotionally. And I don't appreciate having that dedication dismissed as arrogance. George laughed. Actually laughed in a way that came across as dismissive and condescending. Oh, please, Tom. Art form. You put on costumes and pretend to be other people. It's not exactly brain surgery. The insult hit its mark. For a man who had spent decades honing his skills, working with some of the greatest directors in cinema history, and taking on roles that challenged him in ways most actors would never dare, to have his life's work dismissed so casually was clearly a bridge too far. You know what, George? Tom said, his voice rising for the first time since the interview began. I came here today to talk about a project I'm passionate about, something I've put months of work into, something that means the world to me. And instead, you want to sit here and take cheap shots at my career and my character. The studio had gone completely quiet. Even the crew members who had been moving around behind the cameras had stopped what they were doing. This was no longer an interview. This was rapidly becoming a confrontation, and everyone in the room could feel it. One of the co-hosts tried to intervene. Let's just take a step back here. And no, George, Tom interrupted, something he never would have done under normal circumstances. I think George has something he wants to get off his chest. So let's hear it. Let's hear what you really think about actors and the work we do. George, perhaps realizing he had pushed too hard but unwilling to back down in front of millions of viewers, doubled down on his position. Look, I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You Hollywood types live in these bubbles, making these big-budget movies about nothing, and then you act like you're doing something important. Meanwhile, there are real problems in the world that need attention. And you think sitting here every day asking loaded questions designed to make your guests look bad is somehow more important? Tom shot back, his composure finally beginning to crack. At least when I do my job, I'm trying to entertain people, to give them something that might make their lives a little better for a couple of hours. I'm trying to tell stories that matter, that connect with people on a human level. What exactly are you contributing? The attack was direct and pointed, and George's face flushed red with anger. He had clearly not expected Tom to fight back with such intensity. I'm informing people. I'm giving them news and perspective they need to make sense of the world. Tom leaned back in his chair and gave George a look that could have frozen water. Is that what you call this? Information? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like you're just trying to tear people down to make yourself feel better. To make yourself feel important because you never got to be the actor, never got to be the artist. So instead, you sit behind this desk and attack people who actually had the courage to pursue their dreams. The words hung in the air like a live grenade with the pin pulled. George's face went from flushed to pale in seconds, and for perhaps the first time in his career on Good Morning America, he was momentarily speechless. But George Stephanopoulos was not someone who stayed quiet for long, especially when he felt cornered. "Excuse me," George said, his voice rising to match Tom's intensity. "I've been in this business for decades, Tom. I was doing journalism when you were still a struggling actor taking whatever role you could get. Don't lecture me about contributing to society." Tom's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And I was working, George. I was building my craft, paying my dues, learning from every experience. And for the record, I never pretended to be anything. I work because I needed to pay the bills, something you might not understand given your privileged position here." The other hosts were now visibly uncomfortable. One kept glancing between the two combatants like she was watching a tennis match. Another looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. The main co-host, usually the master of controlling chaos on the show, seemed unsure how to handle this unprecedented situation. Privileged position. George's voice cracked with indignation. "I worked my way up from nothing, Tom. I started in local news, covering stories that nobody else wanted to touch. I earned every single thing I have." "And what exactly do you have, George?" Tom shot back, his voice dripping with disdain. "A platform that you use to ambush guests and make them uncomfortable? A career built on asking gotcha questions for shock value? That's your legacy?" George slammed his hand on the desk, causing the coffee mugs to rattle. "My legacy is speaking truth to power. My legacy is not kissing up to celebrities like some people do. I ask the questions that need to be asked." "Questions?" Tom laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call what you've been doing here today? Because from my perspective, it looks more like a personal attack wrapped up in the pretense of journalism." The main co-host finally found her voice. "Guys, we need to dial this back a little bit. We're on live television here." "And no," George interrupted sharply, never taking his eyes off Tom. "If Mr. Hardy here thinks he can come on my show and insult me and my profession, then he's going to hear exactly what I think about his attitude and his arrogance. Your show." Tom's voice rose to a level that made everyone in the studio flinch. "Your show. Last time I checked, this was called Good Morning America, not the George Stephanopoulos Hour. And if you think asking loaded questions designed to make your guests look bad is journalism, then you have a very warped understanding of what real journalists do." The accusation hit George like a physical blow. He had always prided himself on his interviewing skills, and to have them questioned so publicly and so harshly was clearly more than he could tolerate. Real journalists. George's voice was now shaking with rage. Real journalists like the ones who follow you around asking about your personal life. Real journalists like the ones who dig into your relationships and your family. Maybe I should start asking about some of those topics if you want real journalism. The threat was unmistakable, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Tom Hardy had always been fiercely protective of his privacy and his family, and George had just crossed the most dangerous line possible. Tom stood up slowly from his chair, his full height making him an imposing figure even in the confines of the studio. The movement was deliberate and controlled, but there was something in his posture that suggested barely contained fury. "Are you threatening me, George?" Tom's voice was now dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that came before an explosion. "Are you actually sitting here on live television threatening to invade my family's privacy because I called you out on your unprofessional behavior?" George seemed to realize he had gone too far. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I'm just saying that if you want to play hardball, Tom, I know how to play hardball too. This isn't some movie set where you can storm off whenever you don't like the script." "You're absolutely right," Tom said, his voice getting louder with each word. "This isn't a movie set. On a movie set, people have respect for each other. On a movie set, people do their jobs professionally. On a movie set, when someone is clearly out of line, the director steps in and fixes the problem." He turned to look directly at the camera, addressing the audience at home. "Ladies and gentlemen, I came here today to talk about a film that I'm proud of, a film that took months of hard work from hundreds of talented people. Instead, I've been subjected to what can only be described as a character assassination by someone who apparently thinks that bullying guests makes for good television." The studio was now in complete chaos. Producers were frantically trying to figure out whether to cut to commercial. The other hosts were whispering urgently among themselves, and the crew was frozen in place, unsure whether to keep filming or not. George, realizing that Tom had effectively turned the entire situation against him, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Oh, so now I'm the bully. You're the one who's been sitting there insulting me and my work for the last 10 minutes. You're the one who's been acting like you're too good to be here. Tom turned back to face George directly, and the look in his eyes was something that would be talked about for years afterward. I never said I was too good to be here, George. What I said was that I expected to be treated with basic human decency. Apparently, that was too much to ask. Basic human decency? George's voice cracked as he practically screamed the words. You want to talk about decency? You've been condescending and rude from the moment you sat down. You've acted like answering questions was beneath you. I answered every legitimate question that was asked, Tom replied, his voice now eerily calm in contrast to George's hysteria. What I didn't do was sit here and let you use me as a punching bag for whatever personal issues you're dealing with. The accusation that George was taking out personal frustrations on him was the final straw. George's face contorted with rage as he prepared to unleash what would prove to be the most damaging response of his career. George leaned forward in his chair, his eyes blazing with an anger that seemed to consume all rational thought. Personal issues. Personal issues. You want to know what my personal issue is, Tom? My personal issue is entitled celebrities who think they can waltz in here, act like they're doing us some kind of favor, and then get offended when someone doesn't kiss their ring. Tom's face hardened into an expression that could have been carved from stone. And there it is, the real George Stephanopoulos. Not the journalist, not the interviewer, just someone who resents successful people and uses his platform to tear them down out of pure spite. Spite. George's voice reached a pitch that made everyone in the studio wince. You think this is about spite? This is about accountability, Tom. This is about not letting people like you hide behind your fame and act like you're above criticism. Criticism? Tom's laugh was harsh and bitter. Is that what you call this circus? Because real criticism involves actual knowledge of the subject. Real criticism comes from a place of wanting to understand, not from a place of wanting to destroy. George stood up abruptly, matching Tom's earlier move, but where his had been controlled and deliberate, his was erratic and desperate. Destroy? You think I'm trying to destroy you? Tom, you're destroying yourself right here on live television. Every word out of your mouth is proving exactly what I've been saying about your attitude. My attitude? Tom's voice exploded with a fury that had been building for the entire interview. My attitude? George. I have spent decades in this business working with some of the most talented and dedicated people on the planet. I have worked with directors who demanded excellence, with actors who pushed themselves to their limits, with crew members who gave everything they had to make something beautiful. And in all those years, through all those productions, I have never, and I mean never, encountered the level of unprofessional, vindictive behavior that you have displayed here today. The words hit George like a series of physical blows. His face went white, then red, then white again as the full weight of Tom's condemnation sank in. But instead of backing down, he doubled down with a viciousness that shocked even his regular viewers. Unprofessional, vindictive? George's voice was now shaking with rage. You know what's unprofessional, Tom? Coming on a show and acting like you're too good to engage with the hosts. You know what's vindictive? Sitting there with that smug expression, acting like everyone else is beneath you. Tom took a step closer to George's position at the desk, his presence now dominating the entire set. I have been nothing but respectful to every other person on this panel. I have answered questions. I have tried to stay focused on why I'm here. And I have maintained my composure even while being repeatedly attacked. If you see that as smugness, then that says a lot more about you than it does about me. The main co-host made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Okay, everybody needs to just take a breath here. We're going to take a commercial break. And no, Tom said firmly, never taking his eyes off George. I think the audience deserves to see this through to its conclusion. They deserve to see what happens when someone with a platform uses it to bully and harass their guests. George's face twisted into an expression of pure fury. Bully, harass, you arrogant piece of work. I have been doing this job for longer than some of your movie careers span. I have interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel Prize winners. Don't you dare stand there and lecture me about how to do my job. Then act like you know how to do it. Tom shot back without hesitation. Because what you've done here today isn't journalism. It isn't entertainment. And it certainly isn't professional. What you've done here today is exactly the kind of toxic behavior that gives morning television a bad name. The accusation that he was damaging the reputation of his own industry was apparently the final straw for George. He began gesticulating wildly, his voice reaching levels that seemed impossible for human vocal cords. Toxic. Toxic. You want to see toxic, Tom? Toxic is coming on someone else's show and acting like you're doing them a favor. Toxic is treating the hosts like they're some kind of nuisance you have to endure. Toxic is your whole attitude from the moment you walked in here. Tom's response was delivered with a calm that was somehow more devastating than any shout could have been. George, I walked in here with the same respect I show every interview, every journalist, every talk show host I work with. The difference is that they treat their guests with the same respect in return. They ask real questions. They listen to the answers. And they don't use their platform as a weapon to settle personal scores. Personal scores? George was now practically screaming. What personal score could I possibly have with you? I don't even know you. Tom nodded slowly as if George had just proven his point. Exactly. You don't know me. You don't know my work. You don't know my character. And you don't know what I stand for. But that didn't stop you from attacking me from the moment I sat down. That didn't stop you from making assumptions and hurling accusations. That didn't stop you from turning what should have been a professional interview into a personal vendetta. The other host sat in stunned silence as the confrontation reached its peak. One looked like she might cry. Another was staring at her hands. Even the usually composed main co-host seemed at a loss for how to handle the situation. George, realizing that he was losing the battle of public opinion with every word, made one final desperate attempt to justify his behavior. You know what, Tom? Maybe you're right. Maybe I did come at you too hard. But you know why? Because I'm sick of celebrities who think they can coast through interviews without giving anything real. I'm sick of the fake smiles and the rehearsed answers and the pretense that everything is perfect in Hollywood. Tom looked at George for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that was somehow more powerful than all the anger that had come before. George, if you wanted something real, all you had to do was ask real questions. If you wanted to know who I am as a person, you could have asked about my passions, my hopes, the things that drive me to keep working, to keep pushing myself, to keep trying to connect with people through my art. Instead, you chose to attack. You chose to belittle. And you chose to turn this into a spectacle. And now, after all these years of doing interviews, after working with hundreds of journalists and talk show hosts, I can honestly say that this has been the most unpleasant and unprofessional experience of my entire career. With that devastating final statement, Tom Hardy turned and walked away from the panel, leaving George Stephanopoulos sitting alone at the desk, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The studio remained in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most respected actors disappeared through the studio doors, never to return. The confrontation that started as a routine celebrity interview had become something much more significant. A moment that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come, and a stark reminder of what happens when professional courtesy breaks down on live television. Tom Hardy had made his point in the most definitive way possible, and the entertainment world would never look at celebrity interviews quite the same way again. What did you think was the most shocking moment from this incredible confrontation? Was Tom right to walk off when the interview took that unexpected turn, or should he have stayed and tried to work through the confrontation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories from the world of entertainment.